Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Tranter model of 1878, an almost forgotten British Army revolver, and yet one of their very first. More on all that, of course, after the lightbox. With an overall length of 11½ inch and weighing in at 2.5 pounds, this is an old world military revolver, and of course, it's a big bore because we are chambering the 450 Adams cartridge, 6 of them fitted singularly through the side gate, and they're ejected the same way thanks to a fixed rod. If you're a regular viewer of our program, then you know it's kinda hard to get an in-depth fix quite like a primer episode anywhere else on the internet. Remember, it's been made possible thanks to a myriad of donors who make this very improbable show reappear every fortnight. You can indeed join their ranks if you are able, and if you do, you will gain access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, monthly scans, things like that. It's all dependent on how and where you donate. Please check us out at Utreon or Patreon. Alright, let's get into the show. For this episode today, we'll be building fairly directly on 2 previous episodes. The first being the Tranter Revolver of 1868, in which we shot the smaller 5-shot model, and the Webley RIC, a derivative design that saw a lot more popularity in government and civilian circles. Now, I will not go too deep into ground that we've already covered, but I will need to reintroduce Mr. William Tranter. Born in Oldbury, Worcester, England, he was the son of a blacksmith, but likely received his name and tutelage in gunsmithing from his uncle, who was already known to be in the gun trade. William would apprentice at the Hollis Brothers and Company in Birmingham, the center of activity when it comes to British revolvers. Over time, William Tranter would grow. Among his first successes was a particular double-triggered percussion pistol, popularly remembered for being favored by officers in the US Civil War. Starting in 1853, this general pattern would last through several changes before becoming a single-trigger double-action affair. Often called the 4th model Tranter, I like to think of it as the model 1856, thanks to its patent of the same year. Now, thanks to an apparent inheritance and properly applying it to real estate, over time we see Tranter working out of a variety of locations, but the most notable last time was 13 St. Mary's Row. It was in this facility that we most likely saw the model 1868 produced in all of its various forms. A solid frame, compact design, this was a firearm usually found in 450 Adams or smaller cartridges, although it had started as a 442 rimfire. Handmade, they were also hand-fit, and parts were not interchangeable between the guns. The 1868 was definitely an old-world Birmingham workshop pistol, despite some of its modern considerations. Now, this revolver made use of an 1866 patented lockwork, again by William Tranter, although in the patent drawing, the sear is set above the hammer instead of below. This proved to be a very simply constructed single and double action mechanism. Now, since our episode on the 68, I have discovered something rather interesting. This particular patent out of the Belgian archives reveals what appears to be a precursor design to the Tranter that uses the same general construction. However, it is just one suggested mechanism of several in the patent, and I have not had time to review this thoroughly. However, it does reveal again that Tranter may be using existing Belgian designs to his advantage and just patenting them in England. Now, even as the model 1868 was being produced, Tranter had actually already moved on from the St. Mary's Row workshop, combining his income from rents and leases with a fair bit of profit from selling arms, especially to the Confederate States during the US Civil War. Even before the conflict was over, he would actually use those funds to purchase vacant land at 31 Litchfield Road in Aston Cross. This would take several years to develop, but ultimately emerged as the largest and most modern arms factory in Birmingham at that time. Actual construction started in 1866, and it appears the facility was operational by 1868. Of course, it did not just produce revolvers. Tranter also took in orders for rifles and rifle conversions whenever he could. The hope was to have one of the largest concerns in Britain. Particularly, he wanted to target outfitting the massive British Army and Navy with his various firearms, all supplied by the Tranter Gun and Pistol Factory. Now, right about here, I need to clarify that some aspects of the story to come are not entirely clear. We don't have letters or records that prove out the exact thought process on why Tranter would develop the gun that we have here today. But I am going to give my best suggestion on it based on what we do know for a fact. The first of which is that Webley frankly started eating Tranter's lunch. Thanks to a combination of working contacts and aggressively marketing even the smallest successes, the Webley Royal Irish Constabulary revolver would soon surpass the Tranter 1868 in fame and sales. And like we saw in our episode on that gun, it was using a Tranter-derived lockwork, somewhat simplified, but likely under quiet license. I will point out, however, that the RAC's more straightforward right-angled strut would actually come to be an influence on our gun today. Still, Tranter apparently intended to push his existing 1868 revolver. The gun would be scaled up to service specifications, and a number of improved ejectors would be added over the years. Ultimately, however, by the late 1870s, despite repeated minor tests by individual officers, there was no major trial and no key interest in his revolver for military service. Now, this was not entirely the fault of his design, because at this moment there was no official British Army revolver. The British Navy had been tinkering with them for quite some time, but not so much the Army, although there is always an exception. During the Crimean War, the British cavalry found itself short on single-shot percussion pistols, so emergency orders were placed for Colt 36 caliber percussion revolvers. The War Department would ultimately take in over 23,000 of these guns, with 5,000 going to the Army, who soon after the war completely lost interest in what they felt were flimsy wastages of ammunition. In 1855, there would be a further purchase of Dean and Adams revolvers, these being double-action models built on the Beaumont patent. I won't go into too much detail, but these were offered in 2 calibers, both ultimately rejected by the Army in the long run. Just a few hundred larger 38 bores ended up with the Western Australian Police. The British Navy, however, snapped up the smaller and more numerous 54 bore model, upwards of 2,000 in total. Eventually, the Navy would decide to switch to centerfire and started with a conversion method for the percussion Adams revolvers on hand. This began a series of revolvers which we'll cover in detail another time, but also introduces a new cartridge. The 450 Adams, developed in order to easily convert existing percussion revolvers, this was a short, fat, and slow cartridge and remained the British standard until 1880. Now, throughout all of this, the Army still hasn't picked a service revolver and is actively still using single-shot percussion pistols. For some, this was becoming an obvious problem. By 1872, enough complaints had stacked up to motivate some more research on the matter. Initial investigations saw pistols like the Galland, Chamelot Delvine, and Tranter 1868 poked about. Actual trials seem to have begun in 1874, with the War Office convening a committee on December 18th in order to select a breech-loading pistol. Notes about all this are unfortunately sparse at best. We know they experimented with the Navy's Adams revolvers and apparently 2 designs from Tranter, although I'm unsure of their particular makeup. There was also apparently a twin barrel pistol from Wilkinson, and I've seen it claim that it, or perhaps another gun, was chambered for the 450 Enfield rifle cartridge. That sounds very painful. During the same time, there may have been some field trials, particularly of the Adams revolvers, during the Third Anglo-Ashanti War, or the First Ashanti Expedition, which lasted from 1873 to 1875. It appears the selection process had become somewhat mired in options. Those of you familiar with our series know a lot of changes were made in military revolver technology from 1873 until about 1880. By the time you selected a model, it was likely bordering on obsolete in some way. It may just be that the British Army noticed this pattern and ended up stalling for the perfect pistol. While it's not our topic today, I suspect the matter essentially fractured into 2 distinct pathways. The first is, we need a gun right now, we're going around with percussion pistols. And 2, we need a gun for the future, a good gun. The first was solved simply enough by accepting the Navy's Adams revolvers. These were first approved of in November of 1877 by the British Secretary of State for War, specifically for staff sergeants, trumpeters of the cavalry, and for the lancers. Now, the matter would be formalized in the list of changes in early 1878 for the Mark II Adams. Shortly thereafter, it was expanded to include the Mark III as well. Accepting the Adams, however, appears to have been something of a make do and not an ideal scenario. In fact, it appears that there was a fervor building in the commercial revolver space. Inventors and manufacturers were swarming England with patents and samples attempting to lock in a truly massive buyer for their products. Being the largest of the Birmingham pistol men, William Tranter was of course going to throw his hat into that ring. But, as we saw in an earlier episode, he had some competition. Colt's agent in England had told them quite correctly that they needed to lock down on a rugged single and double action revolver of at least .45 caliber. Thankfully, they were already making a very powerful single action .45. While popular in the US, the venerable 1873 wasn't much liked in England, where there had been a lot more market competition in the revolver world. Looking at you, Roland White. Being a multi-piece frame far too large for close-in defensive work and lacking a quick double-action trigger, it had no hope of government acceptance. Now all that said, there is frankly a lot of argumentative correspondence from this period on the matter of Colt's .45 caliber cartridge. Massive by comparison to anything in Europe, it was a lead freight train running on a healthy reservoir of black powder. Power delivery was plainly superior to the .450 Adams, which had been a diminutive conversion cartridge to begin with. And British officers were starting to take notice. Being able to deliver an instant, killing blow was a critical concern to them. The revolver was meant to be a last line of defense, emptied quickly and with resounding effect. Thanks to the Ashanti expedition and other minor conflicts through the 1870s, the .450 had earned something of a reputation for not completely stopping a threat. The result was a general clamor for the US cartridge, or something similar. Now, this fact was so transparent that Colt chose to make their new British gun in such a way that it could be readily converted to either .450 or .45 Colt, which was also handy in terms of being able to sell it at home in the US and abroad. The result was their 1878 double-action revolver. And while it technically checked all the boxes, it did so in a frankly weird way that did not always inspire confidence. Also, we'll see in a future episode, it came up against a new demand for rapid extraction and reloading features. But none of this was entirely clear at the time it was introduced, and it appears the 1878 Colt forced a reaction on the part of Tranter. Now, unfortunately for us, almost nothing is recorded on how exactly he came to his design decisions, but a direct analysis of this gun here makes me feel fairly confident that I understand how it came to be. So let's just dive right in and take a look. Alright gang, we have what is very clearly a Marshall revolver, at least in terms of design. It's practically brutalist for its era. Now, I'm gonna say something interesting about this gun to me, is that it's almost unremarkable in how basic it looks. It looks like a revolver, right? Don't forget what we see from other guns in this era in terms of them having much tighter contours in here. I mean, even like the Colt 1873, which we think of as a big military revolver. It's much narrow in here, it's thin, it's got all these little extra profiling bits. This is rough, ready, this is able. This is definitely Marshall construction. It's heavy, it's beefy, you know? Now, let's talk about in terms of actually using the thing. We have a single action, cock and then pull to trip the seer, boom and fire, and then double action operation. So pull until she drops, boom, okay. That was absolutely necessary for the British. They required the ability to have a double action firing mechanism. The US was still, you know, dealing with single action at that time. We were quite proud of that. Now, otherwise, let's see, we'll flip this guy over. We're dealing with a solid frame all the way around, gate-loaded action. And actually, there's something I really like about this gate. Let me show you. Instead of affixing a latch or a lever or a thumb pad or anything extra to the gate, Tranter's come in and made a semicircular cut into the gate itself in order to give you a space to grab with the pad of your thumb or your thumbnail. That makes it fairly easy to open, and yet requires no extra parts and can't be easily damaged or broken off. I actually rather like that. From here, obviously, we would just load singularly, except, look at that. See how that cylinder's binding up? Don't force it. Don't forget how old this is. This is a manually rebounding revolver. We must click in order to get our hammer and firing pin out of the way of the cylinder so that it is now free to rotate. Only in one direction, mind you, that hand's still doing its job. So from here, we can load our cartridges one by one, close her up, and start shooting as we saw earlier. On the other end though, we have ejection. In this case, you know, let me get a tighter shot on that just so you can really see it. We have a little textured flipper do with a flat spring right here being retained by a screw through the front. What that's doing is it's just providing enough resistance that we pop over a notch that's here on the sort of shielding tube for the ejector rod itself. Now this is a much older gun, so that notch is starting to wear. We may even see a problem with that while we're shooting, but what's supposed to happen is that this is supposed to click into place and not drop while firing. Gravity, however, can have other ideas, especially again with that wear. So with the rod free, we can line up a chamber manually, kick out a spent casing, index this forward manually. There's no support spring here to keep it from getting into the action. It's a potential problem if you think about it. If this can get loose and then get to here, you're gonna end up with a jam up, unfortunately. But we manually index to the next. Now, I will say the system doesn't have any assist for indexing, but it is cut such that if I roll over and hear the click and then walk back, I should be able to eject and I should be able to load, and that way there's at least some sort of indexing point to keep you from getting completely lost and having to just surf around and maybe even accidentally double up and have to go all the way back around. Now, before I go any deeper, let's quickly compare this to our old 1868. Okay, there's a scale difference. This is clearly built for 450 right off the gate. This has some extra room in it that we're gonna talk about in a minute, but in terms of quality, I'm not really sure if it comes through on camera like it does in person, but there's something about the 78 versus the 68 that lets you feel these lines are more parallel. These lines, more of them are machine cut and machine finished. This feels handmade. And we kind of talked about it when we were doing our Webley RIC episode, as a matter of fact, because the Webley RIC felt more manufactured than this gun. And to be fair, that Webley RIC has several years more advancement than this older 1868 Tranter anyway. But this definitely feels like an old world Birmingham handmade gun. And this feels like something that might have come out of Colt in the earlier years. So I wish I could convey it. I wish I could get down in here and sort of show you, oh look, you know, exactly this is more contoured and this isn't. It's not quite that simple to show on camera, and yet you really get a feel for it when you handle these guns. So definitely more modern, definitely mass manufactured, definitely a little more handmade. All right, let me get this out of the way and bring in another gun. This is the Colt 1878. And the reason I'm showing you both of these is because I frankly don't have an Adams Mark III on me at the moment, but I want to talk about what's the same on these guns, all right? Because we have, well, let's see, solid frame with solid frame construction, one piece solid frame construction, one piece solid frame construction, all right? We have a knuckle, in other words, a saw grip on both guns. That's meant to help stabilize your hand for double action pull. And we have single and double action lockworks in both guns. Both are in 45 caliber. Both, well, this one particularly is in 45 Colt at the moment, but could have been chambered in 45 Adams when sold in the British market and into an emerging 455 Mark I and Mark II cartridge that will come on a little bit later. This particular gun, again, has almost an identical looking cylinder in terms of length and size, and yet, don't forget, arguably at the time that this is being made, the only service cartridge really for Britain is supposed to be 45 Adams, or 450 Adams rather, and we saw on our 68 that the cylinder for that is a lot shorter. Now, just to point out something, this gun is marked and proved for 450 Adams, and I believe the large majority, if not all of these, were the same. And yet, there's plenty enough room to shoot what would be Britain's next cartridge adopted in 1880. That could be because Tranter already knew what was coming, or it could be that he was hedging his bets because of the popularity of 45 Colt. And to that effect, let me show you something. This is a 45 Colt Snap Cap, dimensionally the same as a loaded cartridge, at least close enough for what we're doing now. And I want to point out that there's absolutely no problem with doing this. As a matter of fact, it fits so well with no rattle and no looseness, it seems almost intentional. And it may very well have been. And before any of you run out and try to shoot one of these with 45 Colt in it, I will point out, it was only proof checked for 450 Adams. It may be that Tranter was watching what was happening in Britain at the time, and that he knew there was a debate between 450 Adams and 45 Colt, or he may have known that he had a lot of customers that liked 45 Colt because it was actually kind of popular in Britain at the time. It was sort of the big push-to cartridge where people were debating on what they wanted to do next after 450 Adams. So the smart thing to do, especially if you're competing with the Colt 78, is to go ahead and make your gun capable of both, just like the Colt was. Now, I can't say for sure how strongly he built this gun, whether or not it could handle either a military or even hotter commercial load of 45 Colt in that era. And yet, I can say the lands and grooves for the rifling are set up such that it could definitely handle this bullet, and the chamber is definitely capable of chambering the round. As a matter of fact, I see no problem with loading a 45 Colt to the proper black powder load for this gun, and then just going ahead and shooting the lighter load out of that case if you didn't want to have to trim back cases to make 450 Adams all the time. It's all perfectly set up there, and yet we have no real record of Tranter claiming that it was interchangeable between both. However, we will later see Webley compete with this exact gun with really almost an identical pattern, and that's going to be the Webley number 5. The Webley number 5 did advertise the ability to shoot both cartridges, and so it's highly likely that Tranter did the same. Now, let's talk about taking this guy apart, because it's not too bad, and yet it kind of is. If we flip down our ejector and press this button on our arbor, we can actually just go ahead and withdraw it from the gun. Doing this awkwardly on a table so that you guys can see without losing focus. And if we take a look at this guy, we'll see that we have not only the retention spring, but this is our friction Sprag spring. It's doing dual duty. It's putting pressure on the inside of the cylinder, and it is also rotating the arbor in the gun. The entire thing is balanced on one pin right here, kind of at the midpoint, and therefore one end is flexing against the cylinder and one end is flexing up at the front to keep the cylinder in place. Let's go ahead and move that, and we can just flip this guy over, open up our gate, and out comes our actually frankly unremarkable cylinder. This takedown method was actually covered in an 1862 patent, which did not include a drawing, but in its text claimed a central arbor slotted for a spring catch meant to keep it in place in the gun. Now, this particular gun does use a side plate. Unfortunately, I find it of dubious use, and I'll show you why by skipping it for a moment. So there's a single screw that's holding in our grip over at the front. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. All right. As you can see, we have a one-piece grip that tabs in at the rear. This is actually very comfortable, but probably difficult to manufacture. The back of the frame is fairly unsupported, making it very small in terms of jigging as well. All right. This is our mainspring. It's putting tension on our hammer. Now, from our previous 1868 episode, Tranter had a patent in which he put essentially a tube from this side of the receiver through, and that tube was the axle pin for the hammer. That's not the case in this gun. This screw is the axle pin for the hammer, so it's been simplified. The problem with that is, now if we try to remove that screw, this hammer is under tension. It's perfectly fine to do, but it makes it a real pain to reassemble. So getting apart, not a big deal. You just kind of have to give it a little tension and pull, all right? And then we're free. And we can enter the side plate, which is so tightly fit, and there's no prying corners. That means we have to do the little love tap method. And once we have a little looseness, we should be able to get our fingernails in there and sort of rock it back and forth. To be honest with you, this is not my favorite gun to do this method on. There's not a lot of side surfaces to work with. You don't want to strike the mainspring, obviously. And then it's a very tight fit and a fairly light plate by comparison to the gun. It doesn't diesel off very well. But, ooh, we're down in there. Let me see if I can focus that up a little tighter. All right, I've reinserted our screw so that we can actually manipulate this action. With this taken apart without resetting that screw, this hammer will slide up, especially if you try pulling the trigger or anything like that, and frankly, bind to the point that you have to get out the spring vise and everything else. Ask me how I know. So, right now, we have a hammer resting on a sear in the rebounded position. We could go all the way to full cock. We're set right there on the sear again. The sear can be tripped by that little trigger horn extension at the bottom of the trigger, or rear of the trigger rather. It's gonna trip it, it's gonna fall, there's your single action. This horn, by the way, is very indicative of Tranter. It allowed him to shroud the sear. Now, of course, the risk is that this would get damaged, and yeah, you'd have some problems, but it also prevented any sort of negligent fire by something getting behind the trigger and snagging if this were carried around in a cock state, which is weird. I've never really understood why Tranter did that, actually. It seems like such a one-off case problem versus all the other problems of this cracking off, but hey, man. All right, so otherwise, if you've been inside of our RIC episode, you'll recognize this little strut back here, which is very hard to see, and we'll see it better in our animation in a minute, but that guy's our double action. It's gonna push the hammer back until it escapes, and then boom, she can fall. It's sprung to return into its notch. And of course, it brings everything along when we cock it manually. Very simple lock work, very old lock work as a matter of fact. I've actually, since releasing that Tranter episode, managed to find just this week a patent from Belgium from, I believe, 1856 that appears to use an almost identical system, including sharing the spring between the strut and the hand. So it may be that we've been calling the Tranter lock work this the whole time, and yet it's actually, yet again, some unnamed Belgian that didn't get credit enough. Now, if anybody's curious while I'm here, I don't think I've ever showed this particular tool, but a gun like this does require using some sort of spring vise. And since it's a nice old British one, it's not too bad to get at it from the rear, but I thought I'd give a tip to any of you guys that have to work on this stuff. I actually have my own, you know what, let me zoom out. I actually have my own little homebrew spring vise here. This would be a pair of needle nose vice grips. However, I've done several modifications. The teeth have been ground off completely to make it flat. There's some texturing in here, but I don't use that section of them. This is just 2 layers of heat shrink, like cable protector in order to give it a rubberized surface to keep it from slipping. And on this particular pair, I've done a grind out here to really thin down this side so that I can get in and under springs when I need to. And very importantly, this is hugely important if you're going to use something like these. Please don't damage anything by, monkeying around with something very old. It has an eyelet here that allows me to adjust on the fly, because what that means is I can get this close to the size I want, close it, and then I can use like a screwdriver or a punch and rotate this to tighten them down until it compresses where I want. And then when I want to release the spring, as in I'm setting a spring in the gun, instead of hitting this button down here and having it pop open and let the spring snap into position, which could be bad for it depending on how you're aligned, I can actually unwind this and slowly release the spring. That's how most spring vices are supposed to work. However, most of them are designed for, old side lock guns, and there's not a lot of them available in the market for being able to work on tight places like revolvers. So if this helps anybody out, please, by all means, steal my idea. Don't damage your old guns. All right, some of this is a little hard to see crowded on in there, so let's go ahead and make sure we understand it with an animation from Bruno.
To load this revolver, we'll first make sure the hammer is manually rebounded. This clears the firing pin from the cylinder. From here, we just open up the loading gate and insert our cartridges. We'll have to manually index and align the cylinder each time. No mechanical aid here. Afterwards, just close her up, and we're ready to shoot. Welcome back to the good old Tranter lockwork. This will be mostly the same as Webley's RIC, with only some slight modification. We'll start with single action, in which we manually cock back the hammer. But before we do, take note of the sear. It's biased towards the hammer by this semi-independent spring. I say semi because the sear spring is held in place by the lower arm of the mainspring. So, as we cock the hammer, the sear drops into a notch on its breast, holding it rearward until we pull the trigger, an extension on which depresses the sear and releases the hammer to fall. Now while we're drawing back that hammer, this strut keeps the rest of the lockwork tied in. It's biased towards the hammer by a flat spring it shares with the hand. As we withdraw the hammer, the strut is dragged along, which in turn draws the trigger and lifts the hand. Once locked on the sear, we pull the trigger, which lifts the strut out of the opening in the hammer in time to let it crash down. Releasing the trigger causes the strut to lower and snap back into place. The strut is also instrumental for double action fire. We just pull the trigger, causing the strut to rise, until it eventually slips out of the notch in the hammer, allowing it to fall. Returning to that hand, there isn't much exceptional about it. As the hand rises, it rotates the cylinder into alignment so that we may safely fire a cartridge. Here, of course, is the trigger, which is powered by its own separate spring. Its unique shape provides for several operations. This projection tips the sear. Tranter seems to have favored it as a means of keeping the sear completely shrouded and therefore less likely to accidentally trip. And this extension is the cylinder stop, which rises into the correct position as we pull the trigger, stopping the cylinder's rotation at the correct alignment. Honestly, a fairly straightforward and simple system, with frankly little to differentiate it from the RIC. Since the ejector is just a fixed rod flipped up under the barrel, I think we can just get back to Othais for some more history.
Alright, so Tranter has designed and released a revolver to compete with the Colt 1878 for British adoption. How would that fare exactly? Well, technically, not very well. If you think back to earlier in this episode, the Army apparently decided to take two tracks. One, adopt something now, not this actually, that was accomplished with the Adams. And two, design the perfect revolver, which, as it turns out, meant that the gun had to have, well, a rapid extraction system and a rebounding hammer and everything that's not in this gun, unfortunately. Again, the ultimate result would actually be, well, the frankly bizarre Enfield Mark I, which actually was a very advanced pistol. It's just that sometimes you advance too far in the wrong direction. More on that guy another day. If the Adams revolver could just make do for a couple of years, the Tranter 1878 wasn't going to be seeing any government contracts, frankly. Thankfully for Tranter, though, Adams messed up, sort of. Russian victory in the Russo-Turkish War created a worrisome shift in the balance of global power. Britain would pressure Russia into accepting a truce in January of 1878. However, they continued to advance their forces towards Constantinople anyway. Russian influence in the Balkans further upset the European powers. As a result of all of this, the Ottomans would invite British administration of Cyprus, and to make a clear message to Russia, Britain mobilized troops to Malta in March of 1878 in order to keep a flexible staging area in case of response. That meant a great need for arms, specifically the now very new to the Army Adams revolvers. Not this is a Tranter. Unfortunately, Adams had been producing these for years at something of a trickle for the Navy, and hadn't had time to scale up manufacture for the now massive Army demand. Shortages were immediate and without a likely solution in any sort of time frame for a potential new war. The matter was made even worse when during all of this mess, the infantry also finally adopted the revolver. Adams had no hope whatsoever of delivering on the demand without over a year of expansion work. And frankly, they were in bad financial straits already. So, in desperation, the War Department turned and searched about for any standard arms in 450 Adams. Now, you might think that would result in dozens of choices thanks to the Birmingham gunsmiths, but the important factor was that they had to be a consistent model of sorts, and at this time, really only 3 guns were selected and appear in the July 1878 lists of changes. The Colt 1878, recorded as the pistol, revolver, breech-loading Colt, non-interchangeable. The Tranter 1868, recorded as the pistol, revolver, breech-loading Tranter, non-interchangeable. And of course, our Tranter today, the 1878, recorded as the pistol, revolver, breech-loading Tranter, interchangeable. That's a fancy title. Well, before we go any further, we now have an adopted military arm, and so we should probably go ahead and get it in Mae's hand for a little bit of shooting before we go any further. Ooh, that is a big gun. Alright, so when we left off, the British War Department had finally caved in and bought some commercial revolvers. In Tranter's case, they had likely just introduced this guy to the market, and there's some evidence that the 1878 was supposed to be a banner firearm for their new factory. Again, this massive facility was meant to be able to fulfill large government orders, and its modern machinery was put to work on making our gun today more interchangeable in construction than any from Birmingham to this date. We know the 1878 was significant to Tranter because up until this point, all of his prior firearms, all of them, shared a single serial block, different models, different types of guns, all in one continuous line. But the 1878? Well, it started over again at serial number 1, again an indicator of the new factory coming online. Known serials range up to 4,265, but that overlaps with a second revolver model also made at the new factory, the model 1879, which has been seen with serials as low as 4,048. So a rough estimate of 1878 production would be about 4,100 units in total. Unlike other Tranter revolvers, which came in various sizes, chamberings, 5 or 6 shot cylinders, blued or nickel, plain or engraved, the 1878 seems to have been intended to be a martial arm right from the start. Only in 450 atoms, only blued steeled, no engraved models, very few and very minor variations throughout the whole production, which actually might have been really one single continuous large batch, because the 1878 seems to have been adopted by the British forces very soon after it was introduced as a product. Sadly, records aren't clear, but circumstantial evidence suggests 165 Colt revolvers were taken into service. Perhaps upwards of 230 Tranter 1868s were also taken up. The initial purchase request for the 1878, however, was for 2,000 units. Although this would be reduced shortly after, it's now believed approximately 1,500 were accepted. So definitely the leader of this particular pack by far. Those 78s taken into service have their acceptance date stamped into the left side of the frame. These are usually found in February, March, or April of 1879. They also sport a WD War Department marking, and usually have a pair of broad arrows tip to tip, indicating sold out of service at some later date. 1878s would see service with both the Army and the Navy, which technically already had revolvers for some time. In both cases, its service life was very short. This was largely for two reasons, both having to do with ammunition. The first was something of an incompatibility with the earlier 450 Mark I cartridge, which used a two-piece case and an iron base. Apparently the 1878s weren't very forgiving with this construction, fitting too tightly and binding too easily. The second ammo issue is that the 450 was on the way out. Behind the scenes, that whole 450 versus 45 Colt argument had resulted in what might have been a compromised cartridge. The 455 Enfield Mark I, which was never actually an official chambering for the Tranter 1878. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure that this is what it looks like, but we'll see more of that next episode. Since the new cartridge and gun were adopted in 1880 and the Tranters were actually being taken into service in early 1879, it's no wonder that the War Department didn't opt for taking more than 1,500 into direct use. Records indicate that they were already being withdrawn from general service by 1881. However, Ordnance did inspect over 2,000 pieces in total, with the excess being sent out for colonial use. We know of shipments for India, and especially an order for 500 or more for New Zealand. There are further indications for purchases by Australia, Canada, and Egypt. Known examples also display markings from South Africa. It's also believed that some served with the Irish police. Now, most of these would be put to use by local forces like constabularies. While plenty reveal War Department viewing markings, there are also exceptions, especially with New Zealand, where you're more likely to find a Birmingham repair inspection mark instead. Now, in terms of actual field service, well, technically they arrived in time for the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, although I haven't found if they shipped in time to participate in any of the bulk of the fighting. However, they were still in use during the Second Anglo-Afghan War, lasting from 1878 into 1880, and not yet withdrawn from service during the First Boer War of 1880 and 81. In these instances, they could have been issued weapons or even private purchases, as was common for British officers at the time. So essentially, this was an arm that was available quickly and in fairly large numbers at exactly the time of need, and yet failed to make enough of a step forward to secure its place for more than just a few years. An almost forgotten flash right in the heart of the oft-remembered Victorian era of British warfare. Unfortunately for William Tranter, the 1878 would not become the next standard sidearm for the British Armed Forces, but as we'll see next time, he will try again. Skipping just a bit ahead, I do want to touch on one thing, which is that while I suspect most, if not all, the 78s were made in sort of a long batch, final assembly could have lagged well behind, especially because we do see some very high serial number specimens marked for the Kynoch gun factory. That's the same facility, but different name after Tranter's retirement in 1885, which means the private market was seeing sales of this gun at least beyond that particular date. Alright, unfortunately not the most remarkable piece in terms of long-lasting service, one of the shortest service lives of a British piece of military hardware ever, but still an important step, and definitely worth Mae's consideration. So let's get her opinion on shooting this particular revolver. All right, once more, we've made room for Mae.
Hello.
And we have our 1878 Tranter. What a surprise that it was the gun we've been talking about the whole time.
I know, good surprise. Yeah, this is huge. This is a Tranter? I'm sorry. I'm trying to think back. The last Tranter I held was the 1868 Tranter, and that was a really small gun. This is massive by comparison.
Yeah, let's pop a photo of the Tranter, just the Tranter on its side.
Okay.
And just in your mind, without prejudice, imagine what you think the size of that thing is. And then let's have Mae hold it up in front of her face with her hands and stuff to this camera over here.
Okay.
Is that how big you thought it was?
No, not even a little bit.
Huge. I mean, we were talking about how big the Berhanzius is. This is a big boy on top of that.
It's absolutely massive. I mean, it looks gorgeous. It looks really cool. Like, it does have some aesthetically, like aesthetically, it looks a little bit like a Tranter in some ways. Like I see it and I'm like, oh, I think Tranter, but the size just throws me off so bad.
I'm going to be honest before we go any further on this. I was in love with this gun at first sight. Like, when I saw the Tranter 78, like, the profile, I can't explain it.
It's the lines on it. These sharp edges filled with curves mixed in. Like, it's really got some good transition points to it.
The high polished blue, I mean, it's worn on this one, but it had it. The weird trigger horn, the slope of the grip, the knuckle, like the high knuckle. The look of the gate,
like, even something as far as, like, the actual rod itself, that's got a beautiful look to it. It's like got an eye drop look to the front of it.
Yeah, this is like U.S. Old West meets British sensibility.
Yeah.
And I was immediately enamored with it.
It's beautiful. It really does look cool, too.
Yeah, just see.
Yeah. There's nothing boring about this.
Now let's talk about holding.
Yeah, the problem is when you go to hold it.
Okay, so it's in your hands.
It's uncomfortable instantly.
Is it heavy?
It's heavy.
Okay, now go to
it's heavy and it's muzzle heavy. Like everything is forward of my hand. It feels like there's practically nothing back there. Okay. It looks like it has a high bore axis on my hand, unfortunately. I mean, if I scooch all the way up to this knuckle, but then hold up, I'm all the way up to this knuckle.
Yeah, look at that hand.
That looks and feels like that's going to be awkward as heck.
Let me take the gun for a second. I want to see something. All right, stick out your hand.
Okay.
Close your eyes.
Okay.
Stick it out here. Now I'm going to hand you a revolver. All right, now just try to find your grip. Don't open your eyes. Where's your grip at?
I mean, that's where the knuckle is.
Okay. Now, don't open your eyes. Don't.
Okay. Well, I did
cheating.
a little bit. I saw your eyes.
Now, take this and imagine there's an enemy directly in front of you that is the camera.
Okay.
And keep your eyes closed and point. Just point like you're going to shoot something. At the camera.
Okay. What? You told me to keep my eyes closed.
No, keep your eyes closed.
Okay.
At the camera where you imagine the camera is.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, you're doing better than I would.
Oh, okay, I'm right below the camera.
Right, you leveled off, but look at the rake you had to put.
No, I know. I know I'm having to hold down on it. Like I can tell if I was holding straight, I'm pointing up. That's weird.
But you already knew that from handling the gun.
Yeah.
I'm going from blind, so I'm saying like if I just grab this and I just feel for where the gun wants me, it's like okay, there's the knuckle, and I just pointed. I'm super high.
Yeah, you're directly up.
I mean,
that's insane.
I'm way up in the wind, and then if I bring it down, where my finger is sort of at least kind of
somewhat level with it,
somewhere where I can pull comfortably, right?
Right.
Then I'm way down the back of this thing, almost a full inch down
What's
from the knuckle.
What's preventing you from riding up the gun? Just your grip alone. There's nothing you've got helping you with that.
The knuckle's doing nothing for me
right now.
This is a single action curved grip, like an old cavalry style pistol.
Right.
And then this knuckle's on here for some reason.
Honestly, if you took the knuckle away, I'd swear I was holding a Reich's revolver in some ways, just because of that banana bulginess feel to it.
It does not have a good taper.
No, it's really bad.
It doesn't even feel, what we have laying around from the earlier example? This almost feels better.
Yeah,
with
almost.
the bell on the 1851.
Now, that's still too big for my hand, but I could see for you comparing the two.
But look at the trigger.
Yeah.
Look at where the trigger is. Oh God, I'm trying to figure out how to do this for the camera. My finger's way beyond the trigger. I have plenty of room to get in there.
Right.
And then on that, no hope.
No, none whatsoever. And then I'm going to naturally reach for the trigger anyway. Look how far forward that trigger is.
That's
even if I were to scooch all the way up, it's still a really long pull for me.
And then you're pulling at a bad angle at that moment.
Yeah, it's not a great idea. In general, going to hold this thing, it just feels awkward as heck.
No, it's a real letdown because it's a beautiful gun and I get it in my hands and I'm like, what? Creature was supposed to hold this thing.
If I'm all the way up here at the knuckle, granted, I can reach for the hammer pretty easily when I'm all the way up here. That's not too bad.
Can you reach for it down lower?
I mean, no, actually.
The knuckle's down in your way.
So if I'm level with the trigger, so if I feel like a pretty good trigger hold, that feels pretty good. Okay. Right there.
So the knuckle's now your problem.
I can touch it.
So you have to choke up and choke down a lot.
Yeah, essentially, and that's effectively what I'm going to have to do. I already know. Reviewing the footage, I'm all over the place.
I feel like I appreciate Berhensius a little bit more right now.
Just a tad.
Yeah. So, it's got kind of a short hammer spur. You can't really reach it unless you choke up.
Yeah.
It is very aggressively textured, though.
It is. So at least there is that. There's no slipping on that guy, so that is kind of nice.
How's she cock?
That's actually pretty smooth pull. The hammer itself is not, I would call light, but it's definitely not heavy. It's like somewhere in the mid-range.
The hammers on British guns seem to be sprung a fair bit lighter than the American counterparts.
I guess that's what I'm thinking of. So I always try to think like the Colts or something like that. And by comparison, no, this is definitely
They must
lighter.
have better primers, although I've yet to track down any sort of documentation on exactly how hard you had to hit X, Y, or Z primer,
Yeah.
So, okay, we talked to death about the grip.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about how far away the trigger is from the grip. Mm-hmm. Anything else in terms of utility, ergonomics? What's going on?
Well, at least I've got an ejector rod, which that was an improvement over previous episodes where there was none.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, that kind of just kind of fell in there, didn't that? I do wish there was a spring in that, keeping it forward a little bit, or at the very least, why did they put the rail directly underneath where it can just do that? They could have literally rotated the rail for where this travels in just a few degrees over.
What she's talking about is the notch. Okay, let me see this guy.
I didn't even mean for that to fall in there. It just kind of falls.
So when you're banging around on this gun, gravity, the natural fail open state, right,
is straight down. Yeah.
Okay?
That makes sense.
So already not ideal that it wants to be out of position.
Right.
And it has to keep sprung in order to stay into it because, of course, it's going to get shocked and eventually fall.
Yeah.
So this one's worn. It fell. Once it falls, the secondary problem with this design is that the relief cut for being able to move the ejector back and forth,
yeah,
is also on the underside of the cover.
Where it's just going to fall into.
Right, which means if we're using the gun level for shooting, it can just
theoretically just
rock.
Yeah, back into the action.
So in order to keep it, it's almost like if you don't want the ejector rod to tie up, you have to shoot it like this.
Oh, okay,
that's gangster style.
I'm sure that was exactly there in the teachings.
But you know what the funny thing is? It's almost never going to jam the gun if you're this way.
It won't.
Or this way, or this way. You know what I mean? But the exact way we shoot is the one place that they put the relief cut, so that if they had just put it horizontally to the right side.
Or they'd put a spring inside, a return spring.
Yeah, return spring's great, but I mean, even if you don't want to have an extra spring in the gun, just make the cut. It's just a cut. Just make it to the right. And then it 180s, and it's really unlikely to ever get in your way.
And all you have to worry about is at some point it may fall, and then it will just sit there forward. That's it.
So you actually had a tie-up with this thing.
I did. I had one at one point, and I wasn't expecting it because I went to go pull through the trigger, and I was like, there's a hold. And sure enough, I know to check now because after especially episodes like the Patterson where the lever just kept falling into the action, it's like, no, I'm used to this. Give me the zip tie. Although on this one, zip tie would have been really not... Oh, no, you could have still zip tied it right around here, and that
Kept
still
it
would have
from
done. Yeah, it would still captured it somewhat.
And then I guess I already made mention of it earlier in the episode, loading gate.
Yeah, so I really like the idea of this loading gate. I wonder if there is a possibility that having removed metal here, if that makes the gate less solid well, I mean, technically it does, like, so maybe it wouldn't be able to withstand.
I'm going to tell you, though, whatever you lost in terms of the thickness of the gate is nothing compared to the strength of that cut versus having, like, a knob or some other part soldered or pinned on.
Okay.
Like, that is the...
I like the idea of it. It's simple.
Yeah, it's frankly a beautiful way of doing it.
Yeah, and I don't feel like at any point it's snagging a fingernail or cutting my finger bad. And honestly, I kind of like how well captured it is. Once you do reach a certain point, it wants to auto flick over. Like it has a point at which it tucks out. And same deal for going back in. It's a pretty solid gate, honestly, compared to the 68, in which we seriously thought in the middle of recording at some point it was going to fall out.
These are both Tranters. The 68 and 78. This was produced...
Oh, you did have it over there with you.
Yeah. This was produced on into the production of that.
Wow.
Like, don't forget, this particular gun probably was constructed or at least sold the same year that one was. Because both of these guns entered British service in 79, it appears. So, because this is another one that was viewed but then given over to South Africa. So, what happened, right?
Yeah.
It really feels like they were made in two different factories. The springs have gone slack in this one. The whole thing feels like bubble gum. It took me a lot of repair work to get this running. That thing is as hard as steel, because it is.
Oh, yeah. Good solid frame.
Very little wear. None of the springs are slacked.
No.
It's the same man. It's Tranter selling a Tranter. I really think that these two guns, when you look at them and handle them, together, makes you realize it's two separate factories.
Oh,
clearly.
yeah, 100%.
Either that or he really upped his game and put the B team on this one. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, like maybe he dropped that one. He was like, all right, now I'm going to go focus on something else for a while, for a long time. And then he came up with this.
Early in this episode, I said this feels handmade.
It does.
And then, does that feel more machine-made?
This definitely feels more machine-made. It definitely feels more militaristic, I want to say.
Right.
Like, that one doesn't really seem like it at any point should have any sort of military service with it.
Just on the appearance and the handling, which one inspires more confidence?
So, the problems lie with the weakness of this gun.
You're a logical creature.
The grip is better on that one.
It's the same cartridge.
But less
5
rounds.
6.
Yep. And then...
Shorter barrel, but you're working at close range anyway.
And I mean, I guess the worst I have to worry about is like the ejector rod falling forward.
But it's not going to get any action.
No, it's not going to tie up the action at any point.
So there's the thing. Critical malfunctions of the ejector rod
and
a poor grip mean that you would rather have the handmade 455 shot that could be breaking as you shoot it versus the really nice quality gun, right? I think you owe an apology to Berhanzius. You owe an apology to Berhanzius.
Okay.
Because what did he say? No ejector rod and get a good grip. Nuts to everything else.
He's like, yeah, just use my own handmade tool.
You made fun of him.
Well, I still will make fun of him.
Just bring it around, folks. Barhanzius was right.
You know what? This probably didn't fall out when it was brand new. It probably was fine. It's been worn.
So, we go to shooting thing.
Yeah.
We talked about the hammer and how easy it was to cock. We haven't talked about double action. Oh, we haven't talked about sights either.
No. So, actually looking down the sights, they are pretty decent. It's a soft V-notch rear with a pretty tall, thin front. That's like a shark fin, I want to say.
Now, I have the Colt 78, the chief competitor of that piece.
Oh, okay. Are we going to compare sights on this?
No, if I point this,
it's really
I almost can't find the sight if the hammer's forward.
Right. Meanwhile, for this one, no, I definitely can see the sight. Perfect.
It's weird that is a good feature at the time.
Right.
A lot of these guns that were early single and double actions, you couldn't see the friggin' rear sight unless you were already cocked back.
Or some of them still had the rear sight as part of the hammer.
Right.
When they're double and single, it's like, come on, you can't be doing it when it's got double included.
There's a number of double action pinfires that are that way.
Yeah. It's insane to me. It's like, okay.
All right, so sights are good then.
Yeah, the sights are actually pretty decent. I was pretty happy with that. The trigger pull.
Yeah, for single, let's do single. How's single?
For single, I remember like it's still like a pretty heavy single action, I want to say, and squishy. Why is it squishy?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay.
And then double action. So when I'm first pulling through for the double, it's pretty clean and it's pretty even pressure. It's heavy, but it's pretty clean and even. And then we get to that squishy part at the cliff at the very end. And it's a very long pull, too, I want to point out. That's a pretty long, heavy pull, so there's no accidentally shooting this guy, I don't think. But what's that squishiness at the end? It's like I'm feeling like I'm pushing against I can distinctly feel myself pushing at some part in there that doesn't really... It's the sear.
It's the sear.
So remember, when you do double action on this particular gun... so this is actually a benefit of the Marriott system that people don't really realize. So on the Marriott system that we've seen so many times where you have that hammer nose and then the trigger comes back and it flicks past it and it just goes. Mm-hmm. But if you single action, it's got this little extension that cocks back, right?
Right.
When you have that double action, single action system... When you go for double action, the single action sear never really comes into play at all. Right. Which means there's no added spring in the middle of what you're doing. Mm-hmm. Whereas on this gun, you're pulling against one spring, right? Mm-hmm. Until you hit the sear, at which point you start depressing the sear as it's releasing the strut. And now you're up against the sear as well. And so you get this hump in your double action because you're coming back until you hit the next spring and then that stacks and then you can feel it. And it gets real mushy.
It's like mushy and creaky. Not even creaky, I guess it's just mushy and squishy.
Right. And it's not actually releasing on the sear necessarily. It could be releasing... It's really tricky. It could be releasing right with the sear. It could be releasing a little bit after. Yeah. Technically, it could be releasing right before the sear, and your timing should still be okay. Okay. These combos in which you have a sear for single action and something else for double action always leads to a really uniquely difficult timing procedure, and it leads to weird double actions. Yeah. It also is a pain to work on as a gunsmith.
It's too bad. It really does have a great pull up until that point.
It's going to be inherent to anything that uses an independent sear and spring, though. Okay. So, yeah.
And then for recoil at that point, there was more than I was expecting considering the weight of the gun and the cartridge. I thought those two combined, it was going to be like...
You have a little 450 Adams
I felt like it was going to be almost practically nothing. And then it was pretty moderate.
Well, I mean, you shot this guy.
Yeah.
I would have to look at it more closely. We don't have it right now.
I know that one had more recoil to it, but, again,
it's a shorter barrel, same cartridge.
Yeah, so it definitely did. But
lighter gun.
There was still more to this one than I guess I was anticipating.
Which one was more comfortable to shoot between these two double action?
The 68.
Easily.
Okay. I don't even have to hesitate with that. The grip alone on that one made it far easier.
Who had more recoil between the Colt 1878 and 45 Colt and that and 45 or 450 Adams?
Ooh. I know that there was more recoil. Actually, no, there was more recoil coming out of the Colt 1878.
Oh.
There definitely was. But...
Your memory of it.
My memory of it feels like it was equal to this one.
Almost?
Almost.
Yeah?
It's like pretty close to it.
Could you speculate why?
I think it's probably, so it's going to sound crazy, but I'm coming back to the grip again because I want to say...
You didn't really like this grip very much.
I didn't like that grip very much. However, that being said, on this one, I was distinctly able to choke underneath the bird's beak with my pinky, and that helped me to gain the leverage I needed to pull through with the trigger more comfortably.
Now, you're still not fully in the knuckle on that gun.
No, I'm still not. I'm pretty widespread on this gun in general. If you look at my grip, it's pretty spread out with my fingers. No, this one, unfortunately, I can't even get up to the knuckle if I want a comfortable grip. I remember at one point I was like, can I reach down there to get underneath? And I don't even remember if I managed to get there. I think I still had to hold down here and just death grip it to try to hold it all the way back.
My problem is this thing tends to put pressure into my palm in a weird way that discounts the webbing of my hand. And I like being able to drive a gun with the web of my hand. So for the Colt 1878, my hand's big enough to actually get into the knuckle.
Yeah, you can actually utilize it.
I can use a 78 properly. And as a matter of fact, the more I've had this thing around, the more I kind of like it. I'm getting pretty used to this grip.
You and your buddy both have 78s and you're running around with them.
Hi, Tom. So I took this, for anybody side, this is just fun now. I took this 78 to a gun show. They had a Kydex guy. And I got him to do a left-hand draw holster for it because my buddy's left-handed and has a 78 that he loves. And I got it with like the stuff that he likes on it, you know?
Yeah.
And so I brought it to him and I was like, hey, I got your present. And I threw it down. He's like, oh, cool, Kydex holster. What's it for? And he's like, wait, this is huge.
Yeah.
And so he'd started
playing the game for a second.
He came to a gathering of friends and he had like 4 of his revolvers and one of them was a 78 because he was doing the show and tell thing. And so he starts like shoving out, and when the 78 went perfect in there, he was so happy. But that's a side story. So I just want to share some joy.
I know.
I've gotten where I kind of can appreciate this grip, even though I think it's still raked a little too strongly forward, even though it would be better as a bell. The knuckle being in the right spot, especially for me compared to that.
Yeah, I think that made the difference in just recovery from the recoil, essentially. Because on this one, I'm still sliding up all day long until I will slide until I get to the knuckle, and then I have to choke back down,
or even without recovery from the recoil itself, when you come back down and you have to play the choke game to get realigned.
It's a terrible game.
Yeah. So
especially coming from single action, every time getting up to that hammer and having to do the dance all the way down.
Now, can you imagine a world in which that gun had a grip that you liked? Or even just this grip off the 68?
It'd be a better, and this would be instantly way better. Like I wouldn't have as negative feelings on it because unfortunately,
you get the zip tie for the ejector rod and call it a day.
Yeah, pretty much. It'd be perfectly done. They had zip ties back then. They were just leather.
I still love that we're making Berhanzius' case. So
yeah, pretty much.
We have this Colt 78. We have that guy. They're direct competitors. Both of them are competing against the Adams, which we don't currently have. Although I'm going to be frank, the Adams is like
Mark III.
Yeah, or Mark II or whatever. There's a number of versions. We'll talk about them all one day. But I'll be frank, the Adams fires the same cartridges as him. It might have a better grip, I'm unsure. However, it's not going to be in any way more significantly different than that because these are all from a very narrow era of... We got past percussion guns. We're very happy with solid frames. The Brits and the Belgians were very big on the solid frames. The US took a little while to get back to that. And when I say that, I mean not just a solid top strap, but like a one-piece frame construction, right?
Right.
So a largely one-piece frame construction, although this one, the whole grip comes off the back or whatever, but still the frame itself is very strong.
I frankly find that pretty cool.
It's massive, and it's like Colt's first one-piece frame construction, right? So we're in this era of... Well, we've added breechloading. We have to have an ejection system of sorts, be it on the gun or in our pocket, right?
Sure.
So it's single in, single out. There's no abity. There's no, like, the Fanyu's starting to appear, but even that's not a big thing, you know? The best we're getting is, like we talked about in the 78 episode, was the ability to roll and then roll back, roll and then roll back. That's about the best you're going to get.
Right.
Okay? And then the standard for everybody, coming from percussion guns especially, was that everybody understood that they had to do a manual rebound in order to not have the firing pin set down on the cylinder inside the cylinder.
So that you could rotate for loading and unloading.
And a lot of these guns are damaged in the modern era because people don't know to manually rebound them before they start futzing with the internals.
Right, and so you'll find them with hammers that just are a little bit shaved.
Or the firing pins are just beat to death.
Yeah.
And the cylinders always have like chamber notches and stuff. Anyway, so... This is a weirdly narrow era in which it is very modern to have manual rebound, single load, single eject, solid frame, big military revolver, big bore, black powder.
Oh, yeah. Can't argue with that. That's what we have here.
We're starting to see more and more of these guns. You've seen the Berhanzius. You've seen both of these. We need to do the Adams, and there's going to be some more. Technically, it's a single action only, but the Colt 1873 will be in that category too. So far, where's your preference going?
It would definitely have to have double action. That much is like unspoken.
Ooh, single action Army boys on watch.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, you're competing against guns that do have it, so frankly, it's out. There's nothing there.
Right.
It would need to make sure that the action cannot get tied up by the ejector rod, but there does need to be an ejector rod on the gun. So...
Okay, so no Berhanzius.
No Berhanzius.
Now, these two are still in the game, and I'm trying to think of others. So, like, the Chamberlain Taylerson. That's another one of these, solid frames. Okay.
That one would be fine.
Okay. Now, they're all big bore black powder at this point, so there's not really much choice there. But in terms of cartridge power, 450 Adams?
Yeah, that'd be pretty okay.
You think it's okay?
I think it's okay. And then 45, definitely.
Oh, definitely this, but maybe okay 450 Adams.
It's like close.
I think we're kind of in...
Close.
We'll see the British government start to consider this too. I think we're kind of stuck because it's like 45 is a lot.
Yeah.
450 Adams is not a lot.
To be fair, I'm also trying to have the perspective in mind in which these are probably pulled out in an instance of emergency. They're not my main guy to go to. They're my backup, and I want my backup to put him down.
Does 45 Colt sound better to you if I tell you that the Marshall load was lighter than the commercial load?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, why wouldn't it?
Well, because if you're saying like 45 Colt seems good, but it's a little too powerful, I'm telling you there's options in 45 Colt.
Yeah, I know.
450 Adams, though, you're not.
No, yeah. And then on top of that, the last thing probably most critical for me, which is why this one ends up having an issue with it, is the grip. The grip would actually have to be usable by human hands.
Do you remember this trigger?
I'll take it.
Really?
It's still, the grip is still easier to handle.
And you can work the single action without it being
Yeah. It's not a nightmare. The grip makes a difference.
Now, between this and the Chamberlain Taylerson?
Yeah, I'd definitely take the 78. I don't think there's still a question on that one. The Colt 78.
Really? Over the Chamberlain Taylerson?
I think so, yeah.
Now, what about a gun you haven't shot? But we have seen in this show briefly.
Have we?
Yeah, it was popular in the commercial market in the 1870s for France. The Fanu. The actual Fanu.
I have no clue.
Well, it's a Chamberlain Taylerson style in terms of size.
I have to handle it.
You've handled a million Fanus. They've just been smaller ones.
Yeah, but not that one.
Okay. I actually think that the Fanu from the 70s might have been like way more advanced than people think, because even just those detents, big deal when you're talking about...
You do like the detents. You like the little click notches that they set
nothing versus just soup in the dark. Yeah, I think it counts for something.
He doesn't like soup in the dark. I don't know why. Soup in the dark sounds quite nice to
For all
me.
the crap we talked about Colts, look who picked the Colt.
I know. Well, to be fair, pick the Colt out of shit soup.
She's called the Chamberlain Taylerson. I think I'd go with the Chamberlain Taylerson.
Okay.
Out of that list.
Why?
Because the lockwork on this Colt is nightmarish and very heavy. And I just don't remember the triggers being that bad.
So you, as the user of that gun in the field, are going to be going into that thing.
No, but it's less likely. I'm sorry, the Chamberlain Taylerson is less likely to break down. It is. These things, I know they break down because I've repaired 5 of them now after people found out I can work on them.
So he's an expert at repairing them, just so everybody knows.
Don't send me, I'm not doing yours, but like I have, this one actually was not on the show. This is a different one. This one came out of a parts bin.
Okay.
And it has, we laser cut new parts for it.
Oh, right,
and
we
I did the timing from scratch on this one.
That was on David's laser.
Yes. This is a nightmare. Like, I will tell you, and it's going to wear itself out. Like, it's just not a good mechanism.
It will eventually beat itself to death, but hopefully I've got it brand new, so I'm using it great.
Well, I could just keep cutting parts, but that wasn't available at that time. No, I think I'd trust in the Chamberlain Taylerson at that point.
Okay,
There's other guns.
Chamberlain.
What about... No, I don't like the Browns. Yes,
Okay.
Okay.
Good job.
We're going to create a whole new category of Mae's favorite 1870s revolver.
Nope. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'm
What?
just teasing.
No, yeah, oh yeah, we're going to do it. We're going to make a whole list.
All right.
It's going to be special.
I think that's pretty much it, though, in terms of my review
Any
on that
final
guy.
opinions on this guy?
I mean, honestly, I hate that when I first saw this gun, I went, oh, those lines are cool. This thing looks rad. I
It's
can't
like
wait
over
to
there,
have
and you're just
it.
like, oh, this looks so much nicer.
And then you pick it up and you're like, what is going on here?
It is huge. Even to me, my simian brain sees it and goes, oh man, oh
Yeah, right?
man.
You put it down and it looks cool. It's just the moment you touch it, you're like, what happened to my boy?
It's so weird how it goes from here to here and it just becomes disappointing.
Yeah. Just the transition itself. It just goes from font to rad to what happened here.
Yeah. By the way, no notes on the grip or any problems with that. They literally were upset at it because it wasn't advanced enough. As we're going to see, the market suddenly became, boom, hit with all these great options.
Right.
And then 2, the ammo issue, which is that it was really sticking on Mark 1 450 Adams. And the notes I saw say Mark 1, not just Mark 1 and Mark 2.
Ooh, interesting.
So I imagine it must have been the iron base that was really like hitting that back wall and just dragging, or a lot of them said it was too tight chamber, so maybe they're getting mushroomed or something. But this gun came out of service within like 3 or 4 years. In the Navy and the Army. In colonial use, it went on a lot longer.
Those poor colonial use people.
And I have some suspicions about the colonials just shoving 45 Colt or 455 Mark 1 into them and just letting them rip.
Oh yeah, because 45 Colt does fit.
If it's perfectly fine. I mean, they didn't cut, they could have, if they cut the cylinder just for 450 Adams, then there should be a taper there that would prevent 45 Colt.
Yeah.
There isn't. And I've seen guns that are cut for, say, 450 Adams or 455 Mark 1 or both. And those guns have a taper where a 45 Colt will not drop in there.
Interesting.
It drops into this gun that I suspect that Tranter was positioning himself in the market to be able to do everything this gun could do.
Right.
However, when you're going over to be proofed at the proof house, more guns are going to pass if they're being loaded with 450 Adams. So they're only, I want to reiterate, they're only proof for 450 Adams. Do not get a hold of a, frankly, multi-$1,000 rare gun and shove 45 Colt in it because Papa Othais says it'll fit. Okay, that's not what I'm saying.
That's who you are, Papa Othais.
However, I suspect that they were meant to be able to handle it.
Acknowledging that.
Yeah. All right.
But yeah, that's my biggest gripe with it, is that it has the beauty and the looks that I want, and then I go to grab it, and I'm like, oh, this is the biggest letdown disappointment right here.
She says it about everybody.
Yeah, it's true.
All right, so I think this got us ready.
Yeah, I think that's pretty
no
much
final
it.
considerations on this one?
No, nothing really. I hope we get some improvements down the line.
I'm gonna be honest. I'm like a pig in mud with these old black powder revolvers. I'm enjoying it very much.
Yeah.
Mae is not happy.
I'm not happy. And the amount of them.
I feel like we're finally getting to cover.
I know far more about revolvers now than I ever did before, so my appreciation for them has grown throughout this whole series, and my dislike for them has also grown throughout this series.
And in fairness, we covered a lot of 1870s rifles and stuff. It's just we don't think about it that way because they just get carried over in the Great War. The handguns happen at a rate of 2 or 3 to 1 in that period. Like, they keep going through handguns, or there's private purchase options and all this weird stuff, but there's one issue rifle for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. Yeah. And so, naturally, we're going to have more handgun episodes than long gun episodes. Throughout the whole series, there's going to be, when we go into World War II, the number of rifles in even the German army, which had an impressive number of rifles, they still had a lot of handguns too, right? Start thinking in your minds, guys. Like, there's a lot of directions to go in with handguns. And so that is true further back in time as well. There's just going to be more of the antique handguns than there are the antique long guns in a lot of ways.
And they also tell a good story, too, for where things started.
That's fair. Although, until we get, Civil War carbines, there's a lot of those.
Okay.
But
next episode.
We're going to keep walking further forward and back. So stick with us, guys. Thanks for joining in.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, have a good one.
Night, everybody.
Anyway, that's it. So we were talking about 200. You were talking about the Tigre.
Yeah, basically, I just remember saying, that concussive force that hits you that deep in your chest. When the first time you fired it, or the first time I fired it, it was just kind of like making my heart beat in a way, like falling in love for the first time. The drag special looks like it went over well. Oh, yeah, that dropped. Hopefully everybody saw that, saw the podcasty options. Yeah, if anyone didn't listen to the podcast with him in the car ride with his videographer, Elliot, that is there. It's already been released. Check your Patreon, Subscribe Star stuff.
We go to the museum and we kind of wander around. I kind of look at the guys and I say, okay, this is cool and all, but I want to see the other guns. Mm-hmm. There's like, what other guns? We went through the whole place. And I went, no, like the ones that are like upstairs or downstairs or where they store the extra stuff. Mm-hmm. And he goes, they don't have an exhibit for that? I was like, no, but we should just go see what they got.
Right.
Let's get an inventory. He's like, okay, do you know somebody here? I was like, not really, but that's not a problem.